the theme of this webinar is victim blaming. And I think as we begin our discussion, it's important to note that the culture of victim blaming comes in many iterations and can be both overt and subtle. From blind statements of, he shouldn't have been there, what did he expect, to subtler and more sinister assumptions about someone's background, culture, and or social class, such as, well, you know how they behave up there. It's important that we turn a critical eye to how we respond to survivors and how victim blaming, either overt or covert, can cause exponential harm. In my time working in the anti-sexual violence movement, and in particular with sexual assault forensic examiners, there's a lot of emphasis placed on the survivor being able to prove their story. Fear of not being believed and or blamed for what has happened is a huge barrier to seeking assistance, and for good reason. There are consequences for coming forward. After all, as a society, we seek reason and logical explanations for what happens, and in doing so, try to secure a future wherein victimization will never happen to us, because we would be more careful, or smarter, or more prepared. In the past five years, I've shifted my work to focus on providing advocacy for survivors of sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. And I have to say that the concerns that survivors of sexual violence face are in many ways magnified when it comes to survivors of sex trafficking. Guilt, shame, and this culture of victim blaming persists and is inflamed by the general population's misunderstanding of trafficking. And so I have my two colleagues here, Lindsay Smith and Vicky Basra, and I just wanted to take a moment to introduce them. First, we'll introduce Vicky. As the president and CEO of the Delores Barr Weaver Policy Center, Vicky is accountable for ensuring mission focus, strategic partnerships, and brand preservation. Her role includes implementing strategies for growth and improvement, and she works closely with the board of directors to implement the strategic direction of the organization. Prior to this, as the senior vice president, she managed the day-to-day operations and oversaw the implementation of the agency's strategic plan. And she has contributed to a number of research studies analyzing the impact of trauma on girls and young women, and is a frequent contributor to news media on issues related to commercial sexual exploitation, diversity, and women's leadership, and the impact of trauma on girls and young women. Vicky holds an MSW from the University of Tennessee and recently received her doctorate in social work, also from the University of Tennessee. So welcome, Vicky. We also have joining us Lindsay. Lindsay Smith is a survivor mentor with More to Life, and they are an open doors outreach network provider in what we call the Suncoast region. Lindsay, say what city you're in right now, if you would.
Manatee and Sarasota.
Manatee and Sarasota, great, okay. Because we're all over the place. So together with the More to Life team, she supports survivors as they break free from the root causes of their lost identity. She has a passion for victim advocacy and empowering survivors to become champions. So in considering this discussion, one of the things that we wanted to do was just show you this very short video that talks a little bit about victim blaming. And as you watch it, if you wouldn't mind, you can chat in if you like, what you observe, and how victim blaming can be both explicit and implicit. So feel free to type in your answers, and I'll turn it to our technical assistants to go ahead and turn on that video.
These are real statements that professionals have used to describe victims of child sexual exploitation.
The language you use matters.
It affects how people see us.
It makes us feel like what's been done to us is our fault.
And it makes us feel less of a person.
Professionals need to recognise our vulnerability.
We want you to see us as children and as victims.
The only person that should be blamed is the perpetrator.
We depend on you professionals to keep us safe.
Negative language reinforces negative attitudes to victims of exploitation.
And negative attitudes lead to systematic failures to protect us.
Helping us starts with the language you use, so choose it carefully.
Thank you.
Okay, and as we break from that, I'll keep looking for anybody's thoughts as they chat in. But let's turn to Vicky, and we'll start with you. First, will you tell us a little bit about the research you've done on victim blaming?
Yes. Good morning, and thank you for having me as part of this conversation. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, as I've kind of continued my journey through working with victims of trauma and violence throughout domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, and now human trafficking. And so I thought it'd be really important to just start with understanding what are the origins of this concept of victim blaming culture in theory, as well as what does it even mean to be in a culture where victim blaming exists. And so victim blaming theory holds this concept and this idea that somehow the victim is partially responsible for the crime that's been committed against them, right? And it relies on this belief that victims should somehow be aware of the dangers in society. And if they're truly aware of that, then they should take the necessary safety precautions or the safety steps to make sure that they stay safe, or they make the right choices, right? To not get engaged or involved in what happened to them. And therefore, individuals who don't take the appropriate safety steps or precautions deserve to be blamed for the violence they've experienced. And then this results in the responsibility of the crime being removed from the perpetrator and being placed on the victim, right? So that's how it kind of looks from this theoretical lens. And so how did we see this play out in our culture, and how did it get embedded into our culture? What we saw is that early researchers who started looking at interpersonal violence and gender violence really started to use this theoretical lens as the perspective that they started doing this work from. They started looking at this shared responsibility between victims and offenders and focusing on the victim's behaviors and the interactions between the victim and the offender before the incident occurred, during the incident, and after the incident, so that they could, in their minds, better explain why it happened, right? The assumption was that the interaction between the victim and the offender caused the victimization. So it wasn't the behavior of the perpetrator, but the interaction between those two people that caused the victimization. So A and B resulted in C. So what does this end up doing, right? What is that larger picture, and what does it end up doing? Obviously, it shifts the responsibility away from the perpetrator of the crime to the victim. It puts the responsibility of many of the negative behaviors on the victim. And it creates this concept of victim choice, right? It starts to create this language around, well, if the victim had done this differently, maybe it wouldn't have happened. And that's where we usually end up starting our conversations anytime we hear that someone experienced something negative. Now, there's been tons of research done on this. Most of that research has been focused on victims of domestic and sexual violence. The newer research is starting to focus on victims of sexual violence. But even if we take what we know, survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and that research shows, we can get a good understanding of how this is looking in the human trafficking realm. And so there's multiple research that continues to show us that so one example was like in the 80s, right? the policies started shifting where government, states, communities wanted families to stay together. And so the domestic violence attitudes at that time became about how do we build systems, how do we build policies, and how do we build practices that keep families together, right? With that focus, it shifted away from really services that would support women leaving abusive relationships, right? So we saw a reduction in funding for housing services. We saw a reduction in money for employment and education, so that women now felt like they had less of an opportunity or choice to leave the relationship, and that the community expected them to stay. In building these systems, we also then started looking at what is it that these individuals are doing that may be impacting the relationships, that may be causing some of the violence, right? We started looking at red flags. We started looking at, the walking on eggshell concept, and what is it about women's behaviors that may be causing the men to act, or the partner to act in a violent way, right? This then resulted in women starting to look at their own personal behaviors, starting to look at what am I doing to cause the violence, and what can I do to stop the violence. It created this hypervigilance around language, and starting to talk about women recognizing, well, I can tell from the way he shuts the door when he comes home from her work, or the way she does X, Y, and Z, what kind of mood she's in. And languages, even in support groups at that time, really focused on how women could change their behaviors so that the violence wouldn't occur. Rather than supporting women to exit the abusive relationships and holding perpetrators accountable, we started as a community and culture creating methods that were forcing women to stay in abusive relationships and change their behaviors. And so that research showed us how victim blaming can become embedded in a culture across all systems, because the money was flowing into projects and funding opportunities that were causing a victim blaming culture. Programs were being built that were causing victim blaming culture. Everything was playing into building this victim blaming culture. Research also shows us that social attitudes and values of victim blaming can impact professionals' attitudes in all of the helping fields across social services, medical, and even the justice personnel. In one study by Dennis, they found that social workers were unprepared to work with victims of domestic violence, and as a result, ended up showing victim blaming attitudes. And so what that comes back to is, if we're not training our staff and our professionals on how to do the work, it does result in increased victim blaming and how it shows up in our environments, in our cultures, in our workplaces. In another research study, researchers found that 1/3 of physicians held victim blaming attitudes, believing that their patients' personalities led to the abuse and that the victim was getting something out of the relationship. And that is why she did not leave. Again, a professional culture that where the attitudes need to be challenged and the attitudes need to be shifted. We can go on and on. There's multiple research, and I'm happy to share if anybody is interested in learning more about the research out there. But the bottom line is all of these components, including language used in media, can impact how victims receive services, or even if they seek services. In one community, they did research on how a news story impacted whether or not women seeked services. And they found that the way that the news story was written and the language used in the news report reduced women from seeking services in that community, because they felt like somehow it was their fault. They should have been doing something differently. And the decisions that they made at that time is what caused the incidents that they were experiencing. Social attitudes also impact victims' willingness to report crimes or seek support because of the fear of experiencing secondary victimization by the various systems that they encounter, right? One study, after reviewing 150 cases, found that, again, how the community spoke about what they were experiencing impacted whether or not they would seek services. We see this in the sexual violence movement, we see this in the domestic violence movement, and we're seeing this in the commercial sexual exploitation movement. So what does this research mean for victims of commercial sexual exploitation? This victim blaming perspective creates false narratives. It creates this narrative that victims of commercial sexual exploitation actually have a choice in participating in what they've experienced and can choose to leave whenever they want. We hear how their experiences with professionals and frontline staff impact their willingness to seek services in the future. We also know that they are receiving messages from their traffickers not to trust professionals, that professionals believe it's their fault, that, minimizing their behavior, minimizing their experiences, their feelings. And so if they're getting this messaging from this side, and then they do seek professional services, and they're getting the same messaging from the professionals, and the professionals are acting in the way the trafficker has told them they're gonna act, then individuals are less likely to seek services. If the constant message you receive, both from the community and from the people that are supposed to be supporting you, is that somehow this is your fault, you deserved this, that you are less than because of this experience, it impacts your belief about yourself. And so one of the things that we don't talk enough about, but need to be exploring more, is how does victim blaming also impact the therapeutic healing process? So if I'm living and experiencing, not only from my trafficker, the messaging that this was my fault, that I caused this, that this makes me less than, but then when I seek services from professional culture, what I'm faced with is also this experience of shame, and somehow it's my fault, and I had choice, and I could have done something different, then how does that impact my ability to process through my therapeutic process? Because the biggest thing we see with victims of commercial sexual exploitation is their struggle in working through the shame and the self-blame. That's seems to be the place where most survivors get stuck in navigating through that, right? That shame. But when that is held in place by a culture of victim blaming, we don't talk about that, right? We don't think about how the shame they're experiencing, the self-blame they're experiencing is actually held in place because of the culture, the victim blaming culture we live in. And really, so I think, victim blaming continues to impact the work we do from multiple layers. But most of all, it impacts the survivor's ability, a victim's ability, or want or need to seek services that truly will benefit them, and that are from a lens that is aligned with what they truly need.
Vicky, thank you so much. I think I really was, listening very carefully to what you were talking about, and this whole concept of victim choice in particular is something that's really interesting when we work with our individuals who are served through the Open Doors Outreach Network. There's often sort of a question, certainly from the outside perspective, of whether or not a person had a choice, and then also sort of the internal battle of that. So what I'm kind of wondering is, how do you, from your perspective, from the Delores Barr Weaver Policy Center and from your team, how do you, in ways do you sort of try to handle that, like in practical matters, in terms of, how it is that you work with clients?
So a lot of the research that I've done really looks at the early coercive tactics of traffickers in pulling victims into trafficking. And not only the grooming stage, but even prior to the grooming stage, which we don't talk enough about. And that includes, like, when I did my research, many of the stories that I heard about where they met their traffickers were, these traffickers were hanging outside of domestic violence shelters. They were hanging outside of group homes where, you know, children in foster care were residing. They were hanging out outside of the drug rehab programs. They were in spaces where they knew that individuals may have a gap in their lived experience. And so when we can understand that we are talking about someone who's introducing themselves into an individual's life with a lens of, this is my end goal, right? That's the lens that the trafficker is showing up in. But with the survivors or the victims, when they're entering these relationships, there's usually a lived experience that has caused a gap in their life, whether there's a housing gap, right, or a financial gap. And this person is showing up and saying, hey, I will provide housing, or I'm going to provide some kind of financial support to you. There can be a gap of disconnect, right? Relationship or connection disconnect. And this person is showing up and saying, I'm going to fill that gap. But for the survivor victim, they're entering the relationship understanding that this gap is going to be filled, not understanding that this person down the road is going to expect them or is going to traffic them. And so when we can understand, and so the term I came up with in my research was predatory helpfulness, right? Because they're showing up and saying, I'm here to help you. I want to support you. I care about you, whatever it looks like. And it varied for the various stories and women that I was able to hear their stories. But it was always this, like the first engagement was, I'm here to help you. I'm here to make your life better. But what nobody else ever looks at is the predatory nature in which they enter the relationship right from the beginning. And so I coined this term and this theoretical perspective of predatory helpfulness. And when we can really understand right from the beginning what is happening in the relationship and who is coming in with what perspective, it allows us to understand that there is no choice. That if someone came into, that many of us have entered relationships from a similar lens, but because the partner we're with wasn't a trafficker, we didn't end up getting trafficked, right? I mean, I found love in my life because there was a gap, right? I mean, that's why I started dating the person I dated and eventually married him, right? There was a gap in my life and I wanted it filled. I was just lucky the person I dated wasn't a trafficker. And so having these conversations internally within our organizations to truly have our staff understand what are coercive tactics, what does predatory helpfulness look like, so that we can really have them understand what are their personal biases and understanding that they're bringing to this work. And how does it impact how they provide services to those we have the privilege of serving, right? So it's understanding victim blaming culture and the theory. And it starts with understanding our own biases and what we as professionals bring to the work. Do we hold victims accountable for behaviors that they really have no choice over? And then before many of us start doing this work, we really need to look at what are our beliefs, what are our values, and what do we hold, and how do those beliefs and values hinder another's ability to seek or receive services. And I think that comes into, as leaders, we need to include questions within our interview process that check a person's personal values and biases around this work. It means we need to constantly do our own work and check ourselves, including in supervision. When we hear, comments that are victim blaming, having questions, challenging ourselves. Why did we come from this lens? Why did we think this? What is this societal messaging that made us believe this value? Have we paused to ask the why? Right? And I'll talk more about this later. But I think it's also, I think a big part of it is checking ourselves, because I think victim blaming a lot of times results when we don't feel safe, when we're frustrated because the person we're serving isn't doing what we want them to do, right? That's when I start hearing that victim blaming, that wanting to control the behavior, wanting to say, well, why aren't they making these choices? Because these choices would be better for them, right? But at that moment, we really need to check ourselves. And we need to pause and say, did we really look at what is going on in this individual's life that they are responding the way they are responding? Because there is purpose behind their actions. And we always have to understand the purpose behind their actions.
Well, Lindsay, I'd really like you to jump in here if you would. In your work, you do direct service work. You work with survivors every day. With More to Life and through the Open Doors Outreach Network. So in terms of what Vicky had to say, is there anything in particular that resonates with you or that you really wanted to kind of go back to?
No, I mean, thanks, Vicky, for explaining the victim blaming attitude, the language, safety, independence, healing, healing, needs to happen. In my role as a survivor mentor, I'm typically coming in as a second responder to provide emotional support, guidance, and advocacy after law enforcement or paramedics or child protective investigators have met with the victim. But everyone's touch point with the victim is important. Victims who perceive that they're heard, understood, shown compassion and sensitivity are more proactive in their healing.
So, Lindsay, you must encounter this often, the issues of victim blaming in either, and I don't necessarily mean within yourself, but maybe, within other service providers that you work with, and certainly the general public. So how does that impact the lens from which you work?
It does. At More to Life, we are survivor-led by Dr. Brooke Bello. We give victims a voice. We encourage survivors to critically think, to discover their authentic self. When people aren't trauma-informed, they don't understand trauma responses, and instead victims' behaviors get mislabeled when they're being viewed through a negative lens, using words and phrases like weak or manipulative, anger issues. They keep changing their story, attention-seeking. These kinds of words don't instill a desire to learn and grow. It shuts a victim down. They feel discouraged. They lose their voice. They stop reporting and seeking medical attention. They believe they aren't worthy of being anything more than a victim, and they believe it's their fault. We don't see them in charge of their lives, moving through their healing process if they don't value themselves and what their future can hold. Blaming the victim creates a culture of shame, like their trafficker did. Instead, use phrases like good negotiator, passionate speaker. Survivors should be empowered to become champions of their lives.
I just wanted to take a minute. Am I muted or am I unmuted? Can you hear me? Okay, great. You actually had a graphic that you kind of wanted to show, and I'm going to ask our technical assistants just to put that up there for a moment. So do you want to talk just a little bit about this? This is kind of, similar to what you were just saying.
Yeah, you have a person there whose mouth is covered. She's silenced, and she's being silenced by all kinds of perceptions, beliefs, opinions. But when you hear these negative things being asked, even if they're not being asked from a negative approach, when the victim hears that, it silences you. You don't want to speak up. You don't want to come forward. You don't want to be that active role in your recovery and having a better life. So, all of those comments you see on the arms that are written around her face, those are things that silence somebody.
So one thing that I'm hearing from both of you is really that is really sort of the reflection, not just on victim blamers, as in people who are external to the system, but also people who are in the system and who are actually providing services. So I'm kind of curious about how you work with clients who may have absorbed some of that victim blaming rhetoric and sort of taken that as one of the reasons why they may be unworthy of receiving services or wellness.
Lindsay, did you want to respond first?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have designated someone.
Yes, either way is fine.
Technology. Go ahead, Vicky, if you would.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I think from our lens, number one, I think that is the gift that Lindsay and other survivor mentors bring to the work, is that they show up with not only the professional experience and knowledge, but this personal lens as well, that allows for, I think, different and unique and deeper conversations to occur with survivors. And so many times at the Policy Center, we lead with our survivor mentors because we know that they will be able to have deeper conversations than those of us that don't have both the professional and lived experience have. And so I think that is one component of the work that Voices has allowed us to do that really has a positive impact and allows for the challenging of internalized victim blaming to be addressed immediately, because you have someone sitting in front of you who has had similar lived experiences, who's saying, hey, that's not true. That's not what it looks like. And, I'm on a different side of it. And I can tell you, like, it's not your fault. You didn't cause this. From the side of the work that I get to do alongside survivor mentors, I think that for me, a lot of times it is really breaking down and having them understand their lived experience, right? And it's starting right from the beginning of like, okay, so how did you guys meet? What happened there? Was there really choice? What do you think your choices were at that time? If I was in your situation, I don't know which choice I would have made, because those are really hard choices. And so it's really starting to have conversations that start shifting the narrative that they have built in their minds, and others have kind of fed, right? And others have like nourished, and others have said, yeah, this is right. It was your fault. You did cause this. You did have choice. It's starting to take step by step and challenge those narratives and start to say, well, and asking those questions of like, was there choice there? What was the alternative choice? Was that a safe choice? Like living on the street, or someone showing up and saying they love you and care about you and saying, hey, I have a place to live. Do you want to live with me? And you trusting this person, And when we start breaking it down and looking at what was in that present moment, hindsight is always amazing, and we can always make different choices. But when we go back to talking about what was really in place in that moment when you made that decision, I think it really allows individuals to see that there was a lack of choice, and they did what they knew and how they needed to survive in that moment. And I think it is really this concept of really shifting their thought to survival and strength-based lens. You survived, and you are powerful because you knew what you needed to do to survive in that moment.
And we've been, talking about this, during this whole entire discussion, is basically, what's at the root of this? What's the root of that causes victim blaming? And so from your perspective, Lindsay, what do you see is at the root of some of this?
A lack of empathy, people judging the decisions of the victim. You can't put yourself in their shoes. You don't know what you would have done differently to make the abuse stop quicker, for it to not have happened at all, or how you would even heal quicker. Everyone's different, every situation's different. There's no wrong way on how to survive. What worked for one survivor may not work for another survivor. There's this, focus on the victim, on what they endured, when we should be scrutinizing what the perpetrator and what they did.
And the focus. And I thought that was really interesting when, Vicky, when you were talking in the beginning, and especially about child welfare. And we know, and I think it's very common now that still the emphasis is on reunification for families with in child welfare, and kind of discussing how that can perpetuate some of these victim blaming tendencies is really an interesting thing to think about. So, and kind of along those lines, so how is this perpetuated in our own social service systems? So obviously obviously you went with the child welfare, but what other ways do you see that happening?
Social services, expecting the same results using the same methods. And when a survivor doesn't meet their standard, that survivor can be discharged. Trauma is complex. It's stored differently for each person, and survivors really need that individualized care. Victim blaming occurs within service provider networks. Providers communicating with other providers and community partners. It's the words that get used to describe a victim or their situation. It's the tone of our voice. It's our body language.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting from the perspective, because both of you also, in addition to your work, work with the Open Doors Outreach Network. And the way that the Open Doors Outreach Network is structured is really actually kind of unstructured. It's a deconstruction, because there isn't a specific beginning and end. The services come and go based on what the survivor, what their preferences are. And we are prepared for survivors to exit and then come back. And that's one of the things I think that we do that is working towards, creating a more versatile and kind of out of the box thinking about how it is that we can help folks. Do you have anything to add to that, Vicky, as well?
So I think, Lindsay was really on point with her response, and I very much agree with her. And I would add that, there are two additional concepts that really address why we have a culture of victim blaming. And, one is hindsight bias, right? Which I spoke to a little bit earlier, that when we look at an event that happened in the past, we have a tendency to kind of believe that we should have been able to see the signs and predict the outcome. And with that knowledge, it makes hindsight seem like the victim of a crime accident, experience should have been able to predict what was going to happen to them, and that prediction should have allowed them to prevent whatever problem might have occurred. And so it's like this understanding of because of what we know now, past decisions should be made differently. And this isn't just something that happens when we're looking at victims of crime and sexual assault or commercial sexual exploitation. Think about when someone becomes sick, right? How many times we look at their past behaviors to really understand why they got sick or why they're struggling with this illness, right? I think of COVID and how many times, you would hear someone tested positive and then it'd be like, well, they don't wear a mask when they go in public, or they don't do this, or they don't do that, right? It was like immediately we needed to understand what were the behaviors that led to this action. What were the behaviors? Because, we expect people to know better. We expect them to make better choices because we believe that you have a choice in every action or experience that you engage in. And then attached to that is this belief that life is fair when it really isn't, right? And so we have a tendency to blame the victim. And this stems from like our need to believe the world is a fair and just place. When something bad happens to another person, we often believe that they must have done something to somehow deserve what happened to them. And we feel this way because if we start believing that the world isn't fair, then it becomes more apparent that anyone can fall victim to any tragedy. We become aware of this notion that no matter how conscious we are, how safe we try to be, that bad things do happen to good people. But as long as we believe in this concept of like the world is fair, that people deserve what they get, then somehow, and victim blaming, right? Because that's all intertwined, then somehow we can protect our illusion that such a terrible thing or something horrible like that would never happen to me. And so victim blaming allows us to feel safer in the world because my decisions that I make would never, result in me ending up in a similar situation.
Vicky, I love that you mentioned that example of COVID, for example, because as I was preparing for this particular webinar and then listening to NPR this morning, and there was a story about the COVID epidemic in India in particular, and how the estimates were so much different than what had been reported from the government and all these different factors. And I remember sitting there and, kind of thinking about this, what we've been talking about, and thinking to myself, okay, well, what's different about India's population? Do they have a lot older population, et cetera, and all these things. And I realized at that moment, it was like, because I was trying to make myself feel safe, trying to make myself feel a little bit better. And I think that's part of our culture here too. I mean, as an American is, it's very much by your bootstraps. Everyone can, can achieve, everyone, has, equal access, et cetera. And so when someone doesn't succeed or when someone is victimized, we tend to seek out a very rational reason for that. And oftentimes it's not there. And I mean, what can be rational about victimizing someone else? I just, I don't know. So what I wanted to say was to our audience is that we are, in a little bit here, we'll be going into our Q&A section. So if you would like to type in a question, and we definitely welcome them, please chat them into your chat function there. I know that Catherine Yoakley had raised her hand before, and she said something that it's hard to reverse their perception of others that are supporting them. So please put in your questions. But in the meantime, I kind of wanted to go back to Vicky and Lindsay and talk about. Lindsay, when you're working with the survivors that you work with and the team members, or even with some of your community partnerships, what are some kind of specific examples that you think really help to combat victim blaming?
With victims, giving them their power back, creating a safe place where they can share as much or as little as they want, providing trauma education so they don't feel alone in how they feel and how they think, encouraging them think of their future, and then supporting them with their decisions on how they heal. You guys were talking about, choices. And I think that, choices are different from planning. In Florida, we have hurricanes. We don't choose them, but we know of them. We can plan for them. You can't plan for being exploited. You can't plan for abuse. You can plan for natural disasters because someone is going to forewarn you. So there's a difference with, choosing when something happens. It's not by choice. People who sit there and want to judge and, put themselves in their shoes is they're using logic and reason, and they're being able to think about that in a calm state of mind. When you are being abused, you can't think logically. You are reacting in survival mode, and you are just getting to the next step, to the next phase, going through the motions to survive. So there's a difference. There's no choice. You can't plan. You're just on autopilot surviving.
And Vicky, any sort of specific examples that you'd like to bring in?
Yeah, I think there, for me, it starts with, educating professionals. And that is from leadership down. So it's not just focusing on those that are providing direct services, because as supervisors, when we hear it in supervision, we need to know how to address it. We need to know how to call it out. When we hear it in our team meetings, we need to know how to address it. And so for me, there's a big component around, training from top down on how does an organization recognize victim blaming at all levels, internally and externally, in our messaging, in our social media messaging. Are we, perpetuating victim blaming? And even the pictures we post in social media, are we perpetuating victim blaming? And how do we start shifting that and having different conversations? I think there's another piece of, one of my favorite examples of, challenging victim blaming was, an opportunity we had to work with a family, and the young girl, even, she was receiving the services, she was, at a space where she was doing well, but the mom was struggling because the young person kept leaving the home to meet with the trafficker. And every time that would happen, the mom would pick up the phone, call the survivor mentor or the regional advocate or the therapist and complain about this young person's behaviors. And in it, utilize language that we would not see as appropriate language to define the behaviors of a survivor. And I sat with the team and I said, let's really understand from the lens of the mom what she's experiencing. She's terrified for her daughter, and the only way she knows how to respond is the way she's showing us right now. So what can we do, and how can we engage mom so she can understand why this young person is still behaving the way they are? And on the other side, has anybody sat down and had the conversation with this young person why they're still connected to the trafficker? Because there is purpose there. There is reason for that connection. And until we can understand that reason, we are not going to shift that behavior or be able to provide a different alternative to, meet the need so that that connection is no longer needed, right? And so when we started talking to the daughter, what we found was that she was returning to her trafficker because her trafficker was still texting her and saying, I know where you live, and if you don't come, I'm going to show up at your house and I'm going to hurt your family. So in her mind, the only way to protect her family and keep her family safe was to stay connected to this trafficker. She was protecting her family. In her mother's mind, she was betraying her family because she was still connected to the trafficker. And when we were able to all sit down and have that conversation and understand the why behind each of their behaviors, we were able to address the victim blaming that was occurring in that space.
Did you have an example that you wanted to share as well, Lindsay?
No, that was a perfect example. Perfect.
Okay, leave it up to Vicky. She's amazing. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking, Vicky, and kind of some of the progress that we've made in Florida in terms of legislative efforts, policy efforts to decriminalize and to focus on perpetrators and treat especially minor victims as survivors and victims as opposed to perpetrators. What else do you think that we really need to do, and what do we need to do on a policy level or from on a systematic level to really address some of these victim blaming things that are embedded into the actual work that we do? And I'd really like to hear if you have some ideas, Vicky, because I know that you've worked on your dissertation and had focused on this.
I think as long as we continue to create this concept of choice that's not really a choice as a way of engaging survivors in services. So an example to me is the prostitution courts, and they're named differently across the country, right? Where the option becomes you either engage in this service, right, which is the prostitution court, or you're going to go to jail and you have to serve time in jail. How is that any different than the decisions that resulted in a survivor ending up being trafficked? Right? Is it any different? I mean, it isn't. Like, in my mind, it isn't, because either I'm going to be locked up or I'm going to be scrutinized, because now I'm going to be under judicial review and someone's going to be watching my actions and making, if I slip up one moment or make a mistake, there's going to be a consequence. And is this the journey and the healing that I truly need? Is prostitution court the right journey and healing process that I need to get out of to get out of the life? Without understanding their lived experience, without understanding why they even ended up there, and automatically assuming that this is the answer and this is the only alternative, I think continues to perpetuate this cycle of false choice. And so I think that if we continue to build policies and practices that are like, you have choice A or you're going to be B as lockup, that continues to perpetuate the behaviors of the trafficker. And as long as we as professionals feel like we can strong arm survivors into, seeking services, it's not going to work.
I think that's a really good point. And Brent Woody added in, he said, that's so important, Vicky, diversion without empowerment can be harmful. And so one further that I'll take you, and I know that the Policy Center this is near and dear to their mission, is, how does this apply for individuals who are already incarcerated? So they've already incarcerated, they've had this, and they are also a victim of trafficking. And, regardless of whether or not whatever it is that they're incarcerated for is related to their trafficking or not, which probably in many times it is. So, what do you say about that? And particularly like when we're talking about juvenile justice systems?
So I truly believe that there is an alternative to incarcerating our young people, especially those that have been trafficked at any point. And that many times the juvenile justice system perpetuates the trauma that they've experienced and ends up triggering them further. And in those spaces, while many believe that they are receiving mental health services or they're receiving, some kind of therapeutic services, I believe that those services provide enough of a therapeutic environment to help those individuals survive in that environment, right? Because it's a trauma-inducing environment. It is not a trauma-healing environment. And so any therapeutic service you're going to provide in a trauma-inducing environment is really just going to address the trauma you're experiencing by being in that environment. And so I think that we have to understand the lived experiences of these individuals and build responses based on what will truly provide a healing environment and a healing experience. Of course, everybody believes there is a component of our people that may be a danger to others, that may need, unique, may need their needs addressed in different and unique ways. But the majority of young people we're seeing that are incarcerated and have a history of human trafficking, it's that the juvenile justice system is being used to control their behaviors and to keep them safe, right? It's to stop their running. It's to stop them from continuing a behavior versus truly addressing the trauma they've experienced. And how do we create safe environments where they can heal?
Yeah, I want to say that Catherine Gomez, who's with the Department of Juvenile Justice, just wrote in a point, and she said, "Thank you for that point about services provided in an inherently traumatic environment. Gives me some good ideas for the future." Lindsay, what are your thoughts about policy and things that you'd like to see change, especially as you work with direct service?
You know, there have been some great changes over the years. Think how far we've come from the 1950s and giving, women voices. Services have improved, recognition, understanding. It's getting better. There's still work to be done, but understanding, being more open-minded, and giving a voice to the people who need that voice. So changes for that.
Okay. I am looking for any additional questions that come in. And while I'm waiting for those questions to come in, I wanted to ask each of you to take a few minutes to talk about, what is your message to survivors who are experiencing victim blaming? And let's start with Lindsay. What's your message to them?
You're not alone. It wasn't your fault. Don't stop using your voice. Lean on people who believe in you, who support you. Connect with a victim advocacy organization.
And Vicky, what would your message be?
I mean, I would echo what Lindsay said, and I think it's that change service providers and connect with a service provider that values your voice and values your lived experience and believes, believes everything you say and doesn't have that victim blaming lens. You deserve that. You deserve to be working with individuals that create that safe space.
Yeah, I think the issue of belief and sort of a non-judgmental acceptance of survivors is really, really important. That, when someone comes here, I mean, you all are experts in doing this, but it's not like we begin a screening tool the moment we meet someone. We're trying to develop relationships. We recognize that it takes time, and we have patience, and we also recognize that, again, like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of reason for people to not trust, certainly not trust an advocacy organization or anyone. And so kind of being able to work with that and staying present, and I think is a really critical part. So just want to give you just a little bit, if there's any more questions that come in, please type them in now. But I was going to give you each a few minutes just to kind of final words, things that you wanted to readdress or emphasize when we're talking about victim blaming and what you really want people to know. So I'll go back to Lindsay.
With the professionals is put aside the time crunch for the duties of your position, pause, be present with that victim in that moment, understand that surviving a disaster, it's an accomplishment that the victim courageously did. Don't criticize how they survived, and instead lift them up, give them that emotional safety.
Great, thank you. And Vicky.
I think it's really important to provide victim-focused programming policies, and that as practitioners and professionals, we have to address the cultural attitudes that continue to allow victim blaming to occur in all of our professions. And so training of professionals is key if we want to continue to work with survivors, because we have to see working with survivors as an honor and privilege and not like we're doing them a favor. And until we start showing up from this lens that it is our honor and privilege to be able to be on this journey with a survivor, we're going to continue to perpetuate victim blaming attitudes in our work and in our culture.
Brent Woody is a fan of Lindsay. He said, don't criticize how they survived. It's great counsel, Lindsay. Yeah, I think I appreciate that. Well, I want to, we're getting, it looks like we're getting ready to wrap up. I have had many more questions come in, but I wanted to thank, of course, Vicky and Lindsay for being here, for being honest and open and a little bit vulnerable about what's going on here. Really kind of opening us up to talking about how this is victim blaming is not just an external entity, but it's also internal, and in ways that we can kind of address that. So I appreciate that very much. I wish you all your audience members a lovely day, and we will be sending out a recording and an evaluation survey of this shortly. And unless we have any other comments, I would say that we can conclude. Okay, have a great day. Thank you.